This lecture is about Kenneth Burke's concept of dramatism. Dramatism is a literal rather than a metaphorical concept. We're not using dramatism or the concept of a drama to apply to a rhetorical situation. Burke instead believes that a rhetorical situation is a dramatic act. In addition, dramatism is a heuristic device to make clear what is implicit in the idea of an act. When we see something that happens, he wants to provide us some sort of heuristic, that is a template, a set of questions or a set of terms, to apply to the act or the event in order to understand it. For Burke, an action is not just motion, but also is symbolic. In other words, only beings that can make use of symbol systems can participate in rhetorical actions. An action has to have freedom. We have to be able to choose. And we have to have an intention or a purpose in order to accomplish this. This then, Burke would argue anyway, would eliminate animals from the rhetorical scene, because while they can move, they are programmed biologically, and action has to be neurological as well. That is, this rhetorical action has to be standing for something else. It has to be a way of communicating our concepts or differences. The overall goal of dramatism is to determine motive. Again, this is a very specific term. It's a Burkean term. It is not motive in the sense of the motive for the crime. However, it is informed by that concept. Dramatism then helps us to analyze rhetorical utterances, and Burke says that we should ask, what is the motive of this rhetorical utterance? This is how we make sense of it and can then choose how to respond to it. The heuristic itself is the pentad, and the principle of application is the ratio. We can determine motive via the pentads and then applying the process of ratio. The pentad has 5 parts: act, agency, agent, scene, and purpose. After we describe each of these, then we have to look to see what their relationship is to one another. More specifically, in the pentad, act is the deed or what took place. Agency is what means were used. Agent, what person or what kind of person did the deed. The scene is the setting, the background, the situation, the location, and the purpose, overt and covert. So if something happens, a speech, let's say the inauguration speech. So the deed itself is the text of the speech, and it also is a symbolic action of officially designating the point at which the President of the United States becomes the President of the United States. Agency, what means were used? Well, the ceremonial location of the inauguration is important. If you remember, the particular Bible that was used for the swearing in could be a sort of language or canvas. I'm sorry, I kind of switched on to scene. Agency is what means were used. So we have language, we have actions when people put their hands on their hearts and swear. These are sorts of, and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and, you know, swear in, that these are means. Agents, persons or kinds of persons. So we have a Supreme Court justice who does the swearing in, a president, or in the most recent case, Barack Obama, who gives the speech. The scene is what I was describing earlier, the background, situation, location. Again, in this particular situation, outdoors. And the description of who else is there, what's going on. I think even the sound of traffic or other things in the background for this particular inauguration might be relevant. And then the purpose, overt and covert. The overt purpose is to officially mark and celebrate the presidency. The covert might be our sort of interpretation of the kind of tone that Obama set in a particular way. The ratio results after we take a rhetorical event, describe each of the 5 terms. I think it's harder than it may look to describe each of these 5. I think that it's possible to get tangled up. There are times, for instance, when agency can be difficult to separate from scene. So we are going to talk about the Kanye West video. Is the agency the video? Or is the agency language? Is it both of those things? And is it also scene? I mean, the fact that this was on television, but the fact that most people have viewed it on YouTube, all of those things seem to be relevant to scene, but they also seem to have something to say about agency. Now, in the process of looking at a rhetorical event, the other thing that we'd want to talk about is what term receives the greatest attention? What do we have the most to say about? Is it the person who speaks who's the most important? Is it the setting? I gave the example earlier of being on a bus and giving a lecture about Kenneth Burke. Clearly, the setting would be a pretty important thing to consider because it's so unusual. So the setting itself would rise to the surface on this. And further, how do terms interact? There are places in which agents, people, might be very out of place, and other places where they might seem very natural. And so that may not be of particular relevance. So the way in which scene affects the agent, or where the agent affects the act, might be very interesting. We often hear people tell stories about great wisdom that they learned from a child. That would be an example of a ratio to understand an event. We would clearly say that if a child says something very, very wise, that their purpose is probably not overt in trying to be wise to us. Their overt intention might be simply to describe what they just saw. However, the relationship of the agent with what actually was said really emphasizes the power of the event. It's the child himself or herself that makes the wisdom so incredible. So if an adult said the same thing that a kindergartner said, it may not be considered quite as wise, and it might not be quite as good a story. So what does the interaction tell you about motive? So overall, what we're going for is what was the motive of this event, which is the kind of big picture understanding or interpretation. I want to emphasize in dramatism that dramatism doesn't serve as only a descriptive heuristic. In much the same way that the three-part ethos, pathos, and logos are not simply descriptive. It's not enough to look at a rhetorical utterance and describe act, agency, agent, scene, and purpose. Instead, we have to do something with those things that we've described. The first thing that we do is look at their relationship to each other, their ratio. And then we talk about the motive of the rhetorical event. I hope this heuristic is helpful for you in understanding rhetorical events.